A glass broke the music before anyone dared to stop smiling. The ballroom was all sparkle and polish, crystal lights, slow strings, a hush that sounded expensive. Men in tuxedos laughed like they owned the air. Women in sleek gowns moved like a tide. Waitstaff flowed between them with trays of silver. At the center table sat the billionaire CEO, a man who mistook applause for gravity and money for proof. He flicked a linen napkin like a flag of ownership. The napkin was white, folded into a sharp wing. When the black waitress stepped close to refill his water, his voice cut through the violins. "Are you stupid?" he said, each word a stone tossed at still water. The room heard it. The room felt it. The room chose not to move. The waitress did not flinch. Her posture held. A silver pitcher waited above the glass. The CEO waved a careless hand, the kind people use when they do not expect the world to answer back. His guests gave tight, nervous laughs. At a side table, a venture partner stopped writing. A diplomat across the room lifted her head. Near the stage, a publicist's smile lost its glue. The insult did not echo, it soaked. Silence pooled under the chandeliers and crept along the carpet, heavy and clean, like bleach on a stain. The orchestra leader glanced at the strings. They kept playing thinner, like they had been asked to pretend. On a tray, champagne glasses chimed. The waitress lowered the pitcher, finished the pour, and placed the bottle with careful hands. Her uniform was pressed. Her name tag was clean. She had been taught that dignity is not noise. The CEO leaned back, pleased with his aim. He lifted his glass toward the investors, seeking a mirror for his power. "Some people can't handle details," he added, soft enough to pass for a private remark, loud enough to do its work. His grin was a door left open for others to walk through. A few did, offering nods shaped like shields. Across the linen, a board member set down his fork and reached for his phone. The screen lit his face like brief lightning. A message waited from a sovereign fund director. "Confirm at 10? Final terms?" He did not answer. He watched the waitress step away with the pitcher balanced, spine straight, chin level, as if carrying a line nobody else could see. Her path skimmed the edge of the dance floor where light broke into squares. In one, a young server adjusted her bow tie with shaking fingers. In another, a reporter underlined a single word: respect. The air carried citrus and the faint burn of candles. It smelled like closing time in a place that pretended the night had just begun. The master of ceremonies reached the microphone, smile fixed, voice bright. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored." He stopped. No one had told him what to do with a silence that had become a witness. He cleared his throat. The strings swelled on cue, trying to patch the gap. At the center table, the CEO snapped for dessert menus. He did not look at the woman he had tried to erase. He looked instead at the crystal trophy on the dais, engraved with words about leadership and vision. The trophy caught the light and tossed it back, indifferent. Somewhere in the donor gallery, a camera clicked once. A second click followed slower. Then the music fell into the space the insult had made, and the room held its breath, waiting to see who would exhale first. Her silence was not weakness. It was armor. When the insult cut the air at the gala, she did not answer. She simply stood tall, hands steady, and carried on with her work. Yet behind that calm was a story no one in the chandeliered room cared to know. Her name was Maya. She had grown up in a modest brick house on the city's south side, where the windows shook when trucks passed and the nights were filled with sirens. Her mother worked 2 jobs. Her father had been lost to illness too soon. At 16, Maya had balanced schoolwork with shifts at a diner, learning the rhythm of plates, trays, and the language of patience. She carried books in one hand, trays in the other, never letting either fall. Now, years later, she worked the gala circuit to help her younger brother through college. Every paycheck carried his textbooks, his meals, his rent. She wore her uniform like a promise, that she would endure what was asked of her so he could step into a brighter place. Humiliation was not new. Guests had mistaken her for invisible, spoken over her as though she were furniture, tested her with careless remarks. Yet she had learned not to let other people's words define her. She had watched her mother teach dignity at the kitchen table. People cannot shrink you if you refuse to bow your head. That memory lived in her posture. Even at the gala, when a billionaire called her stupid, she did not bend. She steadied the silver pitcher, finished her pour, and walked away with her head level. To those who looked closely, that straight back said more than any reply. The uniform she wore was plain, black vest, white shirt, polished shoes. But to Maya, it was more than cloth. It was proof she could support her family with honest work, that she could stand in rooms meant to exclude her, and still move with grace. Every button fastened was a small act of defiance against a world that expected her to stumble. As she moved between tables, whispers followed, but she did not let them cling. She listened instead to the steady sound of her own breath, the clink of glass against glass, the rhythm of work she had mastered long ago. She thought of her brother's graduation, the day she would sit in the crowd, name tag exchanged for a proud smile, uniform replaced with her own dress of choice. Maya's dignity was not loud. It did not demand attention. It lived in quiet acts, keeping her steps even, setting a glass without spill, holding her gaze steady even when someone tried to reduce her. To the careless, it looked like silence. To those who understood, it looked like strength. The insult at the gala was meant to diminish her. Instead, it revealed her. For in that glittering room full of titles and trophies, the only crown that mattered was invisible, the crown of dignity she carried, unshaken, untouched, and though no one clapped when she passed, the silence itself seemed to bow. The insult did not end at the table. It echoed in the eyes that mattered most. The gala was more than a dinner. It was a marketplace dressed in silk, where billions moved quietly between forks and wine glasses. Every guest was there for more than music or food. They had come to measure power, to judge character, to decide where their fortunes would flow. When the Billionaire CEO called the waitress stupid, he thought the moment would vanish into the noise. But in a room where perception is currency, silence became louder than applause. At the corner table, Margaret Lynn, head of a global pension fund, paused mid-bite. She had overseen investments for millions of retirees, men and women who trusted her with their futures. She knew numbers, but she also knew people. Her pen froze above her notebook, and her mind whispered a question. If he speaks this way to her in public, how does he treat those with no witness at all? 2 rows back, Ambassador Ruiz leaned on his cane, eyes sharp under silver brows. He represented a nation negotiating trade with the very company this CEO led. The insult rang to him not as a slip of temper, but as a signal of deeper arrogance. He tapped his cane once on the floor, a sound small yet deliberate, like the opening strike of a gavel. Closer to the stage, the CEO's own board members exchanged glances they did not mean to share. One adjusted his tie too tightly, another hid his discomfort behind a sip of wine. They had defended this man before, but tonight, under the glare of chandeliers, they saw how hard it would be to defend him again. At the far end of the room sat the pivotal observer. His name was Daniel Harrow, managing director of a sovereign wealth fund. His signature alone would seal or break the $3.5 billion deal waiting in the balance. He had a reputation for stillness. He rarely spoke, but when he did, markets listened. When the insult landed, Daniel did not move. His fork rested on the edge of his plate, untouched. He watched the waitress walk away, steady despite the sting, and his gaze followed her rather than the man at the center table. To him, dignity was not abstract. Years earlier, he had grown up the son of a tailor, watching his father treated as less by men who believed wealth excused cruelty. That memory returned now, alive in the sight of a billionaire mocking a woman doing her job with honor. Around him, conversations faltered and resumed, like an orchestra missing beats. Investors leaned toward their partners, whispering calculations, reputational risk, leadership gaps, brand exposure. The insult had become a number in their ledgers, written not in ink but in doubt. The CEO, unaware, laughed too loudly at his own story. He clinked a glass for attention, but fewer eyes met his. The room had shifted almost invisibly. What he thought was dominance had curdled into evidence. Daniel Harrow finally set down his napkin, a simple motion almost invisible. But to those who understood him, it meant something larger. It meant judgment had already begun. And in that crystal-lit room, where fortunes were measured by more than stock charts, one careless word had turned into a fracture no number could repair. Power can blind a man more quickly than darkness. The CEO believed he was untouchable. To him, wealth was not just protection. It was proof that he could never be wrong. That belief had carried him from boardroom to ballroom, from press conferences to private jets. But behind the shine of his empire lay a trail of moments that revealed a truth he refused to see. In the early years, when his company was still climbing, an assistant once questioned the accuracy of a financial report. She was young, careful, and correct. He dismissed her with a sneer, calling her overly sensitive. Weeks later, her prediction proved true. The loss cost the firm millions. Yet in the retelling, he cast himself as the man who absorbed the risk, never admitting who had seen the danger first. Later, a meeting with engineers. One offered a safer design for a flagship product. The CEO waved him off, saying, "Innovation doesn't wait for fear." The flaw was ignored and recalls followed. The company paid fines. He called it the cost of moving fast. The engineer left quietly, taking his integrity with him. At a holiday party, staff once watched as a janitor accidentally crossed the carpet while the CEO gave a speech. He paused, glared, and said into the microphone, "This is why standards matter." Laughter followed from those too afraid to remain silent, but the janitor's bowed head told the real story. For the CEO, embarrassment of another was entertainment, and applause was a shield. The pattern was constant. Anyone with less power was a stage for his superiority. Every mistake belonged to others. Every victory was his alone. He built towers of glass, filled them with his name, and surrounded himself with mirrors that showed only what he wished to see. Yet the irony was sharp. For all his wealth, his poverty lay in character. He collected luxury cars, but not loyalty. He built offices on every continent, yet created no true community. He filled headlines with promises of progress, but left silence where respect should have been. The insult to the waitress at the gala was not an accident. It was a glimpse into a habit as old as his success, to reduce others so he could rise. But what he failed to see was that the world around him had changed. Investors now measured not only profit but principle. Customers cared not only about price but about people. His blind spot had grown so wide that he could not see the edge of the cliff approaching. In his mind, the insult would vanish with the night. In truth, it had already become the final piece of evidence, proof that arrogance is not strength, and wealth cannot hide contempt forever. A single word can travel faster than light in a room built on glass. The insult at the gala should have dissolved into laughter, drowned beneath violins and champagne. Instead, it lingered, fragile yet sharp, and then it moved, quietly at first, then everywhere. The billionaire's remark, tossed so casually at the waitress, became a ripple contaminating the entire night. It began at the service stations. Waiters whispered as they passed trays, voices low but eyes fierce. "Did you hear?" one asked while balancing crystal flutes. Another nodded, repeating the phrase with disbelief as though holding a hot coal. The words carried from corridor to kitchen, where dishwashers paused in their rhythm, and cooks frowned over simmering pots. Respect had been bruised and silence could not protect it. At the press table, journalists picked up the shift in air. Their job was to notice what others wished to bury. One scribbled a note, "CEO mock staff at gala," and slipped it beneath a program. Another leaned back, phone in hand, thumbs moving with quiet urgency. A single message left the hall. Story brewing. On the investor side, the reaction was less open but far more dangerous. Phones lit beneath linen cloths. Fingers tapped as silent exchanges unfolded. "Unacceptable optics," one message read. "Reputation risk," came another. The deal that was hours from being signed was suddenly being weighed against values, not figures. Each text was a stone added to a scale, and the balance shifted in real time. Even the orchestra felt it. They kept playing, but their eyes flicked toward the head table. Notes stumbled, then recovered, like a voice cracking before regaining control. The music sounded elegant, but the undercurrent was tense. Each chord pressed harder than before. The waitress herself had left the circle of whispers, carrying her tray as if nothing had happened. Yet her stillness only deepened the contrast. While she moved in silence, the room filled with noise, hushed, hidden, multiplying. Her dignity was steady glass. The insult was the crack spreading through it. By midnight, the ripple had reached beyond the ballroom. A journalist's tweet appeared, carefully worded, naming no names but hinting at arrogance revealed at a charity event. Within minutes, replies asked for details. Screens lit in taxis, in lobbies, in homes across the city. A fracture had left the room and entered the world. In the board's private chat, the language grew colder. Pattern repeating. Risk factor confirmed. They had defended him before. Tonight, they measured if the cost of defending him had grown too high. The billionaire noticed none of this. He raised his glass again, laughing too loudly at his own wit. To him, the gala was proof of control. To everyone else, it was evidence of decay. He stood in the center, unaware that the circle around him was breaking. By the time the last song ended and the chandeliers dimmed, the whisper had become a current impossible to stop. Staff carried it home, investors carried it into strategy calls, journalists carried it into headlines waiting for confirmation. A careless insult, aimed like a dart, had missed its target. Instead, it pierced the glass walls of his empire, and the crack began to spread. Silence can be louder than thunder when billions hang in the air. The morning after the gala, a conference room high above the city filled with polished shoes, silver watches, and guarded faces. Contracts worth $3.5 billion lay waiting in neat stacks. Pens gleamed on the table, lined up like weapons. Numbers had been checked and rechecked. Profits projected. Risks weighed. By every financial measure, the deal was ready. Yet the room did not move. At the center sat Daniel Harrow, head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. His expression was unreadable, hands folded, eyes fixed not on the documents but on the faces around him. For hours, the investors had spoken in careful terms: market share, return rates, growth potential. But no one dared to speak of the one thing that now shadowed the room, the insult from the night before. Daniel broke the stillness with a question as sharp as glass. "Do we trust him?" The words landed heavier than any chart or graph. The others shifted in their seats. A board member cleared his throat, tried to speak of profits, then faltered. Another opened his mouth to defend the CEO's passion, but silence pressed the air flat again. The answer was already visible in their hesitation. Daniel leaned back, remembering the moment at the gala, when the waitress had walked away with dignity untouched. He thought of his own father, bent over a sewing table, treated as invisible by men who wore the suits he stitched. He knew arrogance when he saw it, and he knew it could destroy more than balance sheets. It could destroy trust. One investor whispered, "Optics are temporary." Another answered, "Character is permanent." The contrast was clear. On paper, the deal promised thunderous success. In reality, the silence of their doubt was louder. Daniel reached for the pen laid before him. For a moment, it looked as if he would sign. The room leaned in. Papers rustled like leaves before a storm. Then, calmly, he set the pen down. Not across the contract, away from it. The gesture was quiet, almost gentle, yet final. No speech followed. No dramatic declaration. Just silence, heavier than steel, filling every corner of the boardroom. In that silence, $3.5 billion disappeared. Some stared at the table, others at the floor. Phones buzzed but went unanswered. Outside, the city roared with traffic. But inside, only the weight of judgment remained. The decision was made not by numbers, but by principle. The deal collapsed in stillness, proving that wealth without dignity cannot stand. The first flash of a camera can feel like lightning striking glass. Within days of the gala, the story broke open. What had begun as whispers between waiters and cautious texts among investors became headlines filling every screen. CEO insults waitress at charity gala. The words burned across news tickers, poured into morning papers, and scrolled endlessly on phones. The company's logo, once a symbol of strength, now appeared beside words like arrogance, cruelty, and collapse. Journalists traced the moment with surgical care. They described the silence in the ballroom, the waitress who did not bend, the investors who exchanged glances. Photos of the event surfaced. His smirk captured mid-laugh, her steady hands placing the pitcher on the table. The contrast was undeniable. Wealth dripping in arrogance against quiet dignity under pressure. Former employees stepped forward. One spoke of being dismissed for raising safety concerns. Another told of a meeting where he mocked a janitor. Their testimonies painted a pattern, each story stacking onto the last like bricks in a wall closing in. What had once been private shame became public evidence. The media amplified it further. Commentators on evening panels asked the same piercing question. Can leadership exist without respect? Social media turned into a court of its own. Hashtags spread like wildfire, voices calling for accountability. Even loyal customers posted messages of disappointment, their loyalty cracking under the weight of truth. The company's public relations team tried to contain the fire. They released a statement, vague and polished, promising commitment to values. But the world was no longer listening to crafted words. The world was listening to the sound of cameras clicking like thunder around a collapsing tower. At press conferences, the CEO appeared behind microphones, his suit flawless, but his eyes restless. Each flash from a reporter's camera reminded him of how quickly power can erode. Questions cut through the air. Do you regret your words? What does this say about your leadership? He dodged, shifted, and spoke of misunderstandings. But the flashes did not stop. For the staff who had once endured in silence, the reckoning carried a strange weight. They watched as the man who dismissed them now faced the same scrutiny he had forced on others. Their voices, ignored in boardrooms, now carried across nations. Each testimony was another bolt of lightning, striking the glass tower he had built too high. By the week's end, the story was no longer about one insult. It was about culture, power, and the cost of contempt. Analysts spoke of billions at risk. But the public spoke of something deeper, dignity. And in that storm of headlines and flashing bulbs, the image of the waitress walking away with her head held high became more than a detail. It became the symbol of the entire reckoning. Quiet dignity standing firm, while arrogance cracked under the weight of its own thunder. Sometimes the softest voice can outweigh the loudest empire. After days of headlines and storming cameras, the world waited to hear from her. She had not spoken at the gala, had not defended herself on the spot. Yet now, with microphones gathered around a modest community center, the waitress, Maya, finally stepped forward. There was no stage, no polished backdrop. Just a plain table, a single microphone, and a few folded chairs. Reporters leaned in, their pens ready. Cameras clicked, eager for a soundbite that could stretch across the globe. But Maya did not rush. She straightened her notes with steady hands, as though arranging her thoughts like glasses on a tray. Her first words were simple. "I am not here to attack anyone," she said, voice calm, almost quiet. The room stilled, straining to hear. "I am here to remind us that respect is not a luxury. It is the minimum we owe each other." She spoke of her upbringing, her family, her work. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. She explained how every shift she worked was to support her brother's education, how every night she carried herself with dignity because her mother had taught her that worth is not measured by wealth. Each sentence landed heavier than any accusation could. Reporters glanced at one another. The contrast was sharp. While the billionaire had stumbled through excuses and polished statements, Maya spoke with plain honesty. No rehearsed lines, no defensive walls, just truth. One asked if she wanted an apology. She paused. "An apology may never come," she answered. "But what matters is that we learn. That we build workplaces, boardrooms, and homes where no one feels smaller because of someone else's pride." Her words carried no anger. Only weight. Another asked if she realized her story had cost a $3.5 billion deal. Maya met the question without hesitation. If dignity is too expensive, then the price of that deal was already too high. The cameras flashed again, like lightning cutting the air, but now the focus had shifted. She was no longer a background figure in a gala. She was the center of the moral equation. When she finished, she did not linger. She thanked the reporters, folded her notes, and walked away with the same composure she had shown the night of the insult. Her departure left the room hushed, not with scandal, but with reflection. The billionaire still held his towers, his cars, his trophies. But in that moment, Maya held something larger, the final word. And her word, quiet as it was, carried farther than his fortune ever could. A throne can fall without a single stone being thrown. The boardroom that morning was meant to crown a victory. Contracts were printed, signatures prepared, and the $3.5 billion deal waited like a golden trophy on the table. The CEO entered with his usual swagger, tailored suit flawless, cufflinks catching the light. He believed the storm had passed, that money would wash away memory. But the room felt different. Investors sat stiff, their eyes colder than the glass walls around them. Phones buzzed with headlines still raging outside. The silence was not respectful. It was sharp, cutting, impossible to ignore. He began with a practiced smile, praising projections, promising growth. His words filled the space, but no one leaned forward. Across the table, Daniel Harrow, the sovereign wealth director, listened in stillness. Others shifted, exchanging glances. Their minds were no longer on numbers. They were on character, on dignity, on the cost of arrogance. When the CEO paused for applause, none came. Only the hum of the air system and the faint tick of a clock answered him. He pressed on, raising his voice, trying to sound certain. "This partnership will change the market." Still, no response. The silence grew heavier, swallowing his confidence word by word. At last, Daniel reached for his pen. The CEO's chest swelled. He thought the signature was near, but instead of signing, Daniel closed the folder before him. "Trust is not in these documents," he said quietly, "and it is no longer here." The words landed like a hammer. One by one, chairs scraped back. Investors gathered their papers. Some gave nods of finality. Others avoided his eyes altogether. The deal unraveled not with shouting, but with footsteps leaving the room. The CEO tried to speak, but no sound carried. For years he had dominated with his voice. Now his silence betrayed him. The empire he had built stood tall outside the windows, towers of steel and glass, but inside, his throne had cracked. When the last investor walked out, the room was bare. Only the unsigned contracts remained, stacked neatly like monuments to a reign that ended in stillness. In that moment, it was clear. The deal was lost, not to numbers, not to rivals, but to a single truth. Respect abandoned cannot be bought back. Not all riches shine. Some walk quietly in the form of dignity. The same city that crowned billionaires with towers and neon now carried a quieter story. The $3.5 billion deal had collapsed. Headlines roared about markets shaken, investors withdrawing, and reputations crumbling. But away from the boardrooms and cameras, Maya, the waitress at the center of it all, finished her shift, folded her apron, and stepped out into the night. Her shoes clicked against the pavement as she walked home. The air was cool, the streets lined with lights that shimmered against rain-soaked stone. In her bag lay no stock certificates, no contracts, no trophies. Yet she carried something the billionaire had lost forever: unbroken self-respect. She thought of her brother studying late in their small apartment. She thought of her mother's words years ago. "They can insult you, but they cannot define you." Those words had proven true in the most unexpected way. An empire had cracked under arrogance while she, with nothing more than composure, had stood firm. The contrast could not be sharper. In a glass tower across town, the CEO sat in silence, wealth intact but authority shattered. He owned more cars than he could drive, more houses than he could live in, yet none of it could buy back trust. His empire was tall but hollow. Meanwhile, Maya walked a modest street where children laughed near stoops and neighbors greeted her with warmth. She had no fortune, but she had something rarer: the respect of those who saw her not as stupid, but as steady, as strong. The world's cameras had tried to make her a headline, but her true wealth was simpler. It was in every step she took without shame. It was in the way her head stayed level, even as powerful men fell. It was in the hope she carried for her brother's future, purchased not with billions but with sacrifice and care. As she reached her door, she paused and looked up. The city skyline stretched behind her, its tallest towers gleaming like crowns in the night. Once she might have believed that wealth lived only up there, in glass rooms where voices like hers went unheard. Now she knew better. Wealth was not measured in numbers. It was measured in character. The deal was gone, the headlines would fade, but the moral remained. Arrogance can bankrupt even the richest, while dignity enriches even the poorest. Maya turned the key, stepped inside, and smiled at the sound of her brother's pages turning. For the first time in days, she let out a breath of peace. Justice had not come with cheers or applause. It had come in quiet balance, an empire stripped bare. A waitress walking home unshaken, true worth had spoken, and it had not spoken in dollars. It had spoken in dignity.